Hey there, welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Horseshoe Bay, Texas. It is the week of February 5th, 2025, and this week's episode is called Comedy School Part 1. And I am really, really excited about this. This is the first in a series. And what does that mean, Comedy School? Well, it's going to be all about my newest adventure, which is my decision to perform stand up comedy in Hebrew, in Israel for Israelis. It doesn't mean I'm going to stop performing in English in North America and other English speaking countries around the world. And in future episodes, I'm going to explain why exactly I made this decision and what the big challenges are, what my realistic goals are. And of course, I'm going to talk about Israeli humor and how Israeli humor is different from the humor we might be used to in the U.S., especially. And I really plan to share it all with you. I mean, this is like an inside look at what it means to be a comedian kind of starting over. I'm going to talk about the great moments, but I will also talk about the fails, and there could be fails along the way. And one question worth asking is why this topic? Why this topic right now? And I want to address that too, because with everything else going on in Israel, why start talking about stand-up comedy and my decision to perform comedy there? And there's a few reasons. One of them is that I feel like we're reaching, I don't want to say stability, but a point of stasis in terms of what's happening in Israel right now. When I first started this podcast, it was literally a week or two after October 7th of 2023. And the news was so raw and so varied every single time, every week, that it was really a chance for me to bring you a new perspective on life in Israel week in and week out. And if you listened one week, when you came back the next week, you would get a completely different view of what was happening in Israel. And it's really been like that for the past 18 to 20 months. But I feel like right now, with this hostage deal in place, and by no means is it finalized, but there does seem to be a little bit of stability in Israel. It's certainly in terms of how Israelis are feeling in the region. There are fewer surprises. And the podcast, from my point of view, could start getting a little bit repetitive. It could be the same story week in and week out as we reach this point of stasis. And so, one reason I want to change to this topic is because I want to keep the podcast varied and I want to bring a new angle to you besides the one that I've been telling over the past 20 months. But in the last 2 months in particular, it's kind of leveled off into what I feel could be the same story, just told in various ways over and over. So it's to break that repetitiveness. That's one reason. I think a much more important reason is that there's so much more to Israel than just Gaza, hostages, war, Hezbollah, Nasrallah, Lebanon, Syria. I mean, you look at Israel, how it's covered in the news, and that's all you would think that Israel is. But there is so much more to the country. In fact, it's really possible to walk around Tel Aviv and not even know that the country is at war, or that we have hostages in Gaza still. Now, eventually, you would come across posters and billboards, and you'd see those stark reminders. But cafes are full, clubs are full. As I'll talk to you about, comedy clubs are full. People are living their lives. They're going to work. Kids are going to school. And there is so much more to Israel than just the dark side, the tragedy. And so I want to bring you that part as well. More specifically, I really feel that humor is a great way to get an insight into any society, but particularly into Israeli society right now. What people are laughing at tells you what they are uncomfortable about. It tells you what is stressing them out, and it tells you the narratives that they're relating to. So if you want to know a lot about any society, just look at what the comedians are saying. It's sort of a mirror held up to nature, right? Comedy is a really great way to just figure out what is on people's minds and what's going on in their psyches. And my intention here is to not just tell you about my journey to become a comedian in Israel, but also to show you how Israelis relate to humor and how Israeli humor is different from the humor that we might be used to in North America or wherever you might be. And there's another reason. I think that by bringing you the hard news about wars in Gaza and Lebanon, etc., for the past 20 months, it's sort of curtailed my personality a bit. It's allowed only one part of my personality to come out, which is the more intellectual side, the side that's really concerned about Israel, the side that needs to defend Israel and speak up for it. But some of my other parts of me are not able to come through. Some of the parts that really love comedy and love storytelling. And so taking this angle, pivoting a little bit to this new journey that I'm on, I think will allow you to get to know me a little bit deeper and will certainly allow me to express myself in ways that I haven't been able to up until now. And to be clear, I'm going to continue to bring you a little bit of my insights on the news. It's really important to me that you know what Israelis are saying about what's going on in Israel right now. So I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going to continue to take your questions about news events and current events in Israel. That's one of my favorite parts of doing this pod is having you write in and tell me what's on your mind. But I also want you to send in questions about comedy in Israel, humor in Israel, and how it's different from humor in America, what it means to be a comedian and different aspects of the comedian life. You know, I've been doing comedy professionally as my full-time job for over 23 years now. So there's a lot of parts of the job that I might take for granted and just forget that they might be interesting or fascinating or bizarre to people who aren't in the comedy scene. So I'd love to hear your questions about comedy and being a comedian because that can remind me what this chaos is all about and also what you want to hear about as I talk about this comedic adventure. So this is, like I said, part one. In other parts of this series, I do see it as a series that will continue. Like I said, I'm going to explore the why I'm doing it. And believe me, it's not just about Israel. It has to do with some seismic changes that I'm seeing in the American Jewish community in North America as well. I want to talk about humor in general, about what it means to be a comedian, what goes into it, how comedians see the world, how most comedians actually aren't so funny when you meet them off stage. Believe me, I get that all the time. People are wildly disappointed when they meet me because they think, hey, a comedian, he's going to be just a barrel of laughs nonstop. And I got to tell you, honestly, very few comedians are really, really funny when you meet them on a personal level. They are often very serious and see the world through an observational quiet lens, and then they bring what they observe onto stage later on. And so all these aspects of comedy and the comedian's life, that's what I want to bring you over this series in the coming weeks. So today, what I want to talk about is, what does that actually mean? Going back to comedy school. And it really is literally teaching myself to become a comedian all over again. You know, like I said, I've been doing comedy professionally for 23 years. But doing it now in Israel, in Hebrew, for an Israeli audience, it's almost like completely starting over. Now, it's not a complete start over. You know, it's not like I'm quitting medical school to pursue a lifelong dream to become a comedian. I'm not starting at square one. It kind of reminds me of those of you who know baseball. There's a player on the St. Louis Cardinals, Rick Ankiel, I believe was his name, and he was a pitcher for many years and then converted to become an outfielder. Or maybe it's the other way around. He was an outfielder who converted to becoming a pitcher, but I think it's the first way, pitcher to outfielder. But that's sort of how I see what's happening here. A Rick Ankiel-esque pivot from comedian in North America to comedian in Israel. Like, I know what I'm doing. I know what it means to be a comedian. But in terms of the tools, in terms of the techniques, in terms of what it means to have a persona on stage, that I really need to start over. And there's no way to start over except to kind of go back to comedy school. And that's what I'm trying to do right now. I'm putting myself through comedy school with a curriculum that I personally set up. There is no comedy school in Israel that would teach me how to do this. And frankly, I wouldn't want that. I'm talking about a school that I myself am developing for myself to teach me what it means to be a comedian all over again. You know, there's this great word in Hebrew. Lehit apes. Lehit apes. It means to find yourself. But that word in Hebrew, lehit apes, it comes from the root word ephes, which means zero. And lehit is a reflexive verb. Anytime you have lehit in a Hebrew word, it's reflexive. So what does lehit apes actually mean? Lehit apes means literally to self-zero, to find yourself. But the only way you can find yourself, according to Hebrew, is to start at zero again, zero mind, as they say in Zen. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to, in a way, unlearn everything I know until now in order to start over. I want to bring with me the experience I've had, and of course, take that with me. But in many ways, comedy school is about learning from the beginning what it means to be a comedian in a foreign language that's not my mother tongue, for an audience that's very different from the North American audience, and with jokes that need to be either rewritten and adapted or new jokes from scratch, because the ones I've been using in my career for 23 years, and jokes come in and out all the time and new ones develop, but those jokes, they don't necessarily just translate to Hebrew and work on an Israeli stage. So what have I been actually doing these past 2 weeks? I was on a 3-month tour in the U.S., a 3-month tour in the U.S., and yes, landed back in Israel on around January 10th, and had 2.5 to 3 weeks before my current trip. I'm actually in the U.S. right now. Just got here a few days ago for a week-long trip with shows the other night in Teaneck, New Jersey, and this coming weekend in Boca Raton. But during those 2.5 to 3 weeks when I was in Israel, I began the comedy school journey. And what was I doing? I was going to a lot of live shows in Israel and just watching comedians in Israel work live, just to soak up the vibe and get a sense for what the scene is like. I watched a lot of Israeli comedy on YouTube, seeing just Israeli comedians. What's their pace? What are the topics that they're talking about? What what's accepted, what's not acceptable in terms of humor in Israel. I've been writing a lot. Some of it is definitely considering the jokes I have already and like how can they be adapted for an Israeli audience. But I've realized that there are no shortcuts here. That a lot will need to be written from scratch, and so I've been doing a lot of writing. Just the old-fashioned joke writing, brainstorming. What's the premise? What's the punchline? Is it surprising? I at least know the criteria now for what makes a joke work. Back, 23 years ago, I don't think I had any idea that there were such a thing as criteria or technique. It was really just writing what I thought was funny without any rhyme or reason behind it. But now I'm a lot more aware of what goes behind a joke, what goes into it. So that helps. But it is a lot of writing from scratch. And I've also been thinking a lot about, who am I going to be on stage? Ultimately, when people think about their favorite comedians, what they really remember is the comedian, not the jokes. So this might have happened to you, that you'll see a really funny stand-up show for half an hour or an hour, and afterwards, you'll tell someone, "Yeah, I saw this great comedian," and people will say, "Yeah, well, what did he or she say?" And you won't even remember any of the jokes. You'll say, I don't know, but I just know that they were really, really funny." And I think it's because what we're attracted to ultimately is their personality, their persona on stage. That persona is the vehicle, and the persona that I've had for the past 23 years on stage in the U.S. is not necessarily going to be the persona that will work in Israel on an Israeli stage. In fact, I can tell you with just about 100% certainty that that persona will not work. My comedy that I've been doing in North America is very much based on, no one would know this, and I never actually say this on stage, but it's very much based on the tension between wanting to be Jewish and proudly Jewish and observing Jewish custom and tradition and law on the one hand, the tension between that and wanting to fit in mainstream America. And again, I never broadcast that to the audience. I never say, this is what my comedy is about. But underlying all of the jokes is this idea that there's a tension there between Ugh, that old Jewish question of wanting to be Jewish, but wanting to fit in, and what it means to navigate those rough waters of being a committed Jew in a country where you are a minority. And not just a minority, but lately a minority with stereotypes broadcast against you and anti Semitism. What does it mean to be Jewish in this kind of an environment? And that is not the persona, that is not the storyline that will work in a country where 80% of the people are Jewish and where it's taken for granted that the audience is going to be mostly Jewish and where you don't have to feel this tension between who you are and who the greater society is. So although it sounds like what I just described is a very intellectual take on comedy and not a very funny one, that's something I've got to consider is that who am I going to be on stage? Because who I've been for the past 23 years isn't necessarily going to, is not going to work. It's going to be different. By the way, it's not something that you can necessarily plan either. I think a persona is something that develops over time. It's kind of like a personality. We all, maybe there have been time in our lives when we've tried to choose our personality and dictate what our personality is. As you know, it never works. Our personality is what it is when we're feeling our most natural and not trying. And it's the same thing on stage. You can't try to be a certain type of comedian. That would never work. But it's worth considering that who I have been will not be the same person I'm going to be on stage once I am in Israel. So that's something I have to take into account too. Another thing I've been doing is I've been watching a lot of American comedy, and it's been really wonderful. It's kind of like rekindling a romance or looking through the photo album of when you first met your spouse and remembering all the, the times when it was really fun. Not that being married for 26 years like I have been is not fun, because it certainly is, but it's fun in a different way. It's fun in a deeper way, a more meaningful way, but it's, come on, 25, 26 years of marriage. It's not like the romance was in the beginning. And when you've been doing comedy for 23 years, you sort of forget why you fell in love with it in the first place. And often it can feel like a job, because it is a job that pays your bills. But now I'm going back and I'm rewatching, all the comedians that inspired me, watching some comedians that I'd never watched before, but who are popular now, and learning, just learning about the different styles of comedy, and reminding myself that there are many ways to be a comedian. Uh, and I'm really falling in love with the idea of stand-up comedy again, because for a long time, for 23 years, it's been my profession. It's been what puts food on the table and what paid my kids' day school tuition, which thank God I no longer have to pay now that we're in Israel. But, at one point, I had 4 kids in Jewish day school in Westchester, New York. So, that, yeah, comedy was a job. Comedy was what paid for that. And so some of the love, I think, was lost, and now I'm remembering again why I fell in love with it. And just to give you a shorthand of some of the comedians I've been watching, probably my all-time favorite comedian is Brian Regan. If you don't know who he is, look him up. I think he might have the record for the number of appearances on Late Night with David Letterman. Letterman absolutely loved Brian Regan and put him on, multiple times. And Regan was one of the first ones that I was inspired to do comedy because of him. He's clean. His humor is just the observational stuff of everyday life, but really the minutia. Seinfeld is known as the comedian who whose show was about nothing and who focused in on the minutia of daily life. But before Seinfeld was doing it, there was Brian Regan, and Brian Regan, I think, actually has more material than Seinfeld. You can, he has hours and hours of material, and I mean, obviously, they're both wonderful. But Brian Regan, I don't think, is as well known because of Seinfeld's, the sitcom. He's more popular and more of a household name. But Brian Regan is one that I've been watching again. Dave Attell. If you don't know Dave Attell, he's part of what in the mid 90s really became known as the alt comedy scene. This was when it was Dave Attell, Todd Barry, Sarah Silverman, Mark Maron, Louis C.K. They were performing in this. There was one club in New York called the Luna Lounge, and it wasn't I don't even know if that was the name of the club or that was just the name of the club that night. It was just like a place with a stage, and they would have these alt comedy nights, and you were seeing comedians who were doing different types of material. And one of my favorites then, and one of my favorites now still, is Dave Attell. Just really clever, biting, dark humor, completely unpredictable. Jeff Ross is another comedian who was really popular at that time, and I've actually worked with Jeff Ross before, and we corresponded a bit. But he's a great guy, and he's mostly known for doing the Comedy Central roasts. That was his thing. He would always produce those. But those are just a few of the comedians that I've been really delving into and exploring all over again, and it's really made me fall in love with the art form, and that's good because I couldn't go on this journey of trying to perform comedy in Israel in Hebrew if I didn't love it, if I didn't feel like it had to be done. Like a lot of the professions in the arts, you can't do it because you kind of want to do it. You have to do it because you really, really want to do it and feel compelled, almost like your life will be incomplete if you don't do it. And that's how I'm feeling right now. And watching these other comedians has certainly contributed to that. So right now, I'm going to tell you about 3 elements of stand-up comedy that I'm really focusing on during this first period as I embark on the journey. So number 1 is figuring out what the Israeli audience is like. Comedy is the only art form where you absolutely need to get an emotional response out of the viewer or out of the listener, out of the audience. And if you don't get that emotional response, you have failed, right? So you can go to a museum, the Museum of Modern Art. I went a couple of weeks ago during the tail end of my last tour here in the U.S. And there were pictures that spoke to me, and there were pictures that didn't really do anything for me. But I still knew it was a beautiful painting, even though it didn't evoke anything in me emotionally. I could still tell it was a beautiful painting. And we've all heard, background music. We've all been somewhere when there was a jazz quartet playing in the background, and that music didn't really necessarily move us on a personal level, but we could appreciate it, and it was pleasant, and it was good music, and we knew it was good. And for many art forms, that's enough just to appreciate that it's good. Um, and it is successful just in the fact that we acknowledge its goodness, even if we can't describe why we think it's good. Oh, I just spilled on myself. Comedic moment. Comedy, however, you need that emotional response. If the audience doesn't laugh, there's no such thing in comedy as, yeah, I knew it was good, but I didn't actually laugh. Well, then you failed if the audience is not laughing. So, as much as I need to think about my writing and paying attention to what other comedians are doing in Israel, a big part of what I'm trying to do right now is just learn the audience. How is the Israeli audience different? What do they react to? What do they not react to? What topics are in their psychological ecosystem? What topics are out of bounds? Just from watching these past, 2 weeks, I've gotten a sense of what the Israeli audience is like, and this is a topic I'll go into more deeply in a future episode in this series. But that's definitely number 1, is learning the Israeli audience. Number 2, I'm trying to learn what humor is out there right now in Israel. Not that I would try to copy it and do more of it or consciously not do more of it, but I think it's important to know just, what's in the scene. What are comedians talking about? Um, what kind of stage personas do they have? Do they tend to be aggressive and loud? Do they tend to be quiet and cerebral? Something in the middle? Do they tend to be fast? Do they tend to be slow? All these, the rhythm of a comedian is very important. And I'm trying to get a sense a little bit of what the ground rules are from the comedian's perspective. Again, not that I'm going to try to shoehorn who I am into that, but you got to know the rules of the game. You can't become a great player at any sport unless you learn the rules of the game. And so that's part of what I'm doing by observing the comedians as well, as seeing, what is an Israeli comedian and how is it different from maybe my concept of what a comedian here in North America is. And the third thing, and probably the most important, is what are the paths to improvement? This is very different than what I was thinking about when I first began doing comedy 25, 26 years ago. And I've been doing it professionally, full time, 23 years. But there were 2 to 3 years when I was not doing it professionally, when I was learning what it meant to be a comedian. And I was also on the side, God, I was working through temp agencies. Do those exist anymore? But man, that was hell. I remember getting these calls from Manpower, this temp agency, 6:30 in the morning, and I would type Excel sheets. I knew how to do this back then. Excel was new, and I knew how to do it, so that gave me a leg up. I worked in an auto parts factory in Bolingbrook, Illinois. I mean, any temp job you can imagine, I had it. I was a math tutor for a long time. I was a substitute teacher in the Evanston school system, teaching math, and really loved that. By the way, I've always loved tutoring math. I was a math minor in college, and just get a lot of fulfillment from tutoring. But there were 2 to 3 years there where I was supporting myself doing these other jobs. And here's what's different. My main focus during those 2 to 3 years when I was starting a long time ago was, how do I get an agent? Or how do I get a booker to look at me? How do I pass the audition? It was very much focused on the achievement and getting to the next stage. And I gotta say, I realize now how naive that was. I think a lot of comedians, that's what they usually want at the beginning, and probably a lot of actors and musicians and painters as well. Now my goal is not that at all. I believe that will come at the right time when it's supposed to come. But now I am much more concerned with, how do I get good? What are the paths to improvement? Is there an open mic scene in Israel? And if so, where are these open mics, and who's in the audience, and how often can I go up? I remember I told you I worked with Jeffrey Ross at one point. We did the Montreal Comedy Festival the same year. It was actually kind of early on in my career, early 2000s or late 90s, somewhere in there. And we ran into each other at the airport the next morning, and we were sitting and having coffee in one of the airport coffee shops in Montreal. And he was asking me how often I went up on stage. And I told him, I'm trying for like 2 or 3 times a week. And he said, you have to go up every night. And I kind of thought that was extreme, but now looking back, I mean, he's completely correct. And that's what I want to do right now. If I could in Israel, I would go up every single night. And I know that that is the only way to get better. I can write the best jokes in the history of jokes, but until you say them in front of an audience, until you get those words out of your mouth, not only out of your mouth, but now out of your mouth in a language that isn't the one you grew up speaking, that joke isn't worth anything. So the audience, I want to learn, the comedians, what are they talking about? But first and foremost, I'm trying to learn, where are the opportunities to get better? Where can I go up every single night so that I can start doing this act and falling on my face? There will be a lot of failure, a lot of falling on my face along the way. It's not going to feel good. It's going to sting, and I'm probably going to want to quit. I won't lie to you, but I won't. Um, and I must say, part of doing this podcast, it's motivation for me, because I don't want to check in with you week after week and then finally say, hey, I gave it up. I mean, I'm putting it on the line here, telling you what I'm going to do. But the only way it's going to work is if I can get up on stage often. I think realistically, 4 to 5 nights a week. I'm still going to have Shabbat with my family for the time being. And I don't know how likely it is that I'd get up on Saturday nights in Israel, because that's the main night people go out. Those are usually reserved, I guess, for the comedians who are already in the system. But if I can go up 4 or 5 times a week, that's my goal right now, because at the beginning, it's just getting those words out of your mouth, getting the jokes spoken out loud in front of an audience, and finding out what the paths to improvement are. That's probably the most important part of my comedy school right now. So like I said, in future weeks, I'm going to talk about why I'm doing this, what I'm learning, how comedy can act as a barometer into a society and tell you what a society is actually thinking about and going through. And I always ask for your questions about current events and news, but I would really love to hear your questions about comedy and about what it means to be a comedian and comedy in Israel. I saw someone wrote in the chat right now a question. I'm not going to answer it now, but I'm going to take a screenshot of it after this is over and address it next week because these types of questions about comedy. Um, they remind me what you're interested in and will give me some guidance too about what I can talk about in future weeks as this series grows. So, what do I hope that you're going to come away with? Well, number one, I really want you to come away with a deeper understanding of Israeli society through the lens of humor. As I start describing to you in future weeks what Israelis are laughing at and talking about on stage, I think you'll get a new insight into what Israelis are going through right now and who Israelis are. I want you to have a deeper understanding of comedy in general and how comedians think, how comedians treat the world of comedy as a business, and just how serious comedy is. You know, comedy is actually a very serious topic. It's like any science and any art. You have to take it seriously. So being funny is actually a serious business. And I want you to come away with a deeper understanding of that. And finally, I want you to come away with a deeper understanding of what it means just to be a comedian day to day. How we think, how we write jokes, how we succeed, how we fail. I plan to put it all out there. I plan to share everything with you. I'm very confident, but I won't lie. I'm also scared shitless. I mean, I'm going into a completely new world here. And, without a net, when you're on stage, it's like you're naked in front of a room full of people. There is no way to hide. You are completely vulnerable. So, on the one hand, that is very scary. But on the other hand, I'm embracing it and looking forward to it and looking forward to bringing you along on this journey with me. So now we're going to pivot really quickly to some news. As I promised, I'm always going to still talk about the big news stories coming out of Israel. And right now, the main story I want to focus on is what's happening with the hostages. Since we last spoke, more hostages have been released. We're about, I guess, halfway into, or maybe a little less than halfway into the release of the first 33 hostages, not all of whom are living. And a number of you wrote in commenting about just how well the hostages seem to be doing, just how healthy they look, that they seem to be doing not just okay, but actually pretty good. And we've also seen video of them smiling and hugging their families. And I got to tell you, this, on the one hand, surprised me as well. I don't think anyone knew what to expect when we saw hostages coming out of Gaza. What would it actually look like? The last time hostages were let out, 14 months ago or so, um, many of them were, most of them were walking upright and looked okay, but that was still, they had only been held relatively a short period of time compared to the hostages now, and so we didn't know what to expect. But like many of you, I was pleasantly surprised to see how well and how healthy and how okay in general many of the hostages looked. At the same time, I won't lie to you. It also concerns me how well and healthy they look. And here's what I mean by concerned. I'm a little concerned that the rest of the world is going to see them looking like they do and think, being a hostage in Gaza, it's actually not that big of a deal. Hamas took care of them. Hamas gave them gift bags. They treated them like guests, the way you're supposed to in Arab culture. What are Israelis complaining about? Why are they going to war against Gaza and Hamas when their hostages are actually being fed and treated well? So look, of course, I want the hostages to be healthy and to come out looking well, but it does concern me. It has entered my mind that it could be easy for the world to gloss over just how difficult it's been for them and just the hell that they've been through. And to be clear, not all hostages are coming out looking vibrant and alive. I'm thinking of those four women soldiers who were linked hands and raised hands on the stage in Gaza before being released, and really embodying the Israeli spirit. But at the same time, uh, we think of someone like Yarden Bibas, who, as someone just commented, he came out looking like a broken man. And he is a broken man. Not only was he held hostage for close to 500 days in Gaza, but all indications are that his wife and two children were murdered either on October 7th or soon after. And it just it just concerns me a bit that the world would gloss over what the hostages have been through. And this raises another point, which is the idea of what I call destruction porn. Hamas is very into the pornography of destruction. They thrive on the world seeing pictures of dead bodies or live bodies that are faking dead. We've seen those film, the footage of that where there'll be there's famous footage of a dead baby in Gaza, and the baby suddenly starts moving because it's not actually really dead. It was just staged, and there are countless examples of this. But Hamas really thrives on destruction porn and the pornographizing of death and destruction. And they get a lot of attention, and they're winning the PR war because of it. Now, Israel, on the other hand, it's the complete opposite. We're doing everything we can to try to protect the privacy of the hostages and what they've been through. And little by little, we're learning what the hostages have been enduring, whether it's being beaten or being shackled to chairs or being kept in cages or being forced to perform sexual acts with Hamas captors or on each other. But we learn it in little bits. We're not turning it into pornography. We're not glorifying it the way Hamas is. And I got to say, Hamas has an advantage in the PR war because of their willingness to do that, their lack of respect for human dignity and the human soul, which we do have. But because we're not willing to stoop to that level, it means we're going to lose the PR war because we don't have the pictures to parade around and the stories to parade around that we do. Being victims is part and parcel of the Hamas and Gazan narrative. It's their bread and butter. And Israel's refusal to be a victim, our desire to protect the privacy of those who've been victimized, uh, it can convey the wrong message. It can make it seem like we're not actually suffering and our hostages don't have it that bad. And that does concern me a little bit. All right, let's go to questions. A lot of questions this week. I'll see how many I can actually get to. So Caroline from Canada wrote in. She said, I find it incredibly ominous that Israel insisted that Arbel Yehud be immediately freed, given that she is a civilian. But Israel did not insist that Shiri Bibas, who is also a civilian, be immediately freed. To me, that suggests that Israel already knows the heartbreaking worst. So, Caroline, I agree with you. Arbel Yehud, Israel insisted that she be released because the terms of the hostage deal were that all women civilians be released and then women soldiers. But what Hamas did instead is they released these four women soldiers before Arbel Yehud had been released. And so finally this week, Arbel Yehud was released ahead of schedule. But Caroline raises the question, why did Israel not insist that Shiri Bibas be released, as she's a civilian as well? And most Israelis, I got to tell you, Caroline, most Israelis agree with you. We suspect, let's put it this way, I don't know any Israeli who is confident to any degree that Shiri Bibas, and her two kids are still alive. I think we all know by now that of the 33 hostages who are going to be released in this first stage, that 7 are confirmed dead. Most of us are assuming that of those 7, Shiri and her 2 boys are among them. I mean, just the idea that a baby that young could survive, that children that young could survive the hell of being tortured in Gaza for 500 days. It's unlikely. Um, Statistically, it would seem that they are most likely the ones to part of that seven to not be alive right now. But we know that seven hostages will be coming home in body bags or however they're brought home, not alive. And I agree with you. The fact that Shiri Bibas, Israel did not insist that she be one of them. It is ominous. It does send the signal that Israel, I think, might have accepted by now that it's more than likely that those three are not alive. Very sad, but also explains why Yarden Bibas can hardly rejoice at being set free as a hostage. His world is completely broken. Karen wrote in to ask, here's a question that bugs me a lot about the destroyed areas of Gaza. What are they going to do with all the concrete and other debris that is not reusable when they clean up the mess that used to be Gaza? Just wondering, and keep up the good work, Joel. Well, thank you, Karen, for that. And hey, that's a great question. What is going to happen to all the debris in Gaza? Northern Gaza has been 90% destroyed. Think about that. 90% of the infrastructure in northern Gaza has been destroyed, and a large percentage of the rest of Gaza as well. Where is all that garbage going? Well, Trump's, I don't know what his exact position is. Wickoff, is he the advisor to the Middle East or whatever? He was in Gaza this past week, and he was very honest. He said that rebuilding Gaza is a 15-year project minimum. And I think we need to accept that this is true. It is going to be, Gaza is not something that we can clean up overnight. We're to rebuild Gaza after Hamas is, demilitarized, of course, but to rebuild Gaza, I mean, that's a major, major project of infrastructure. And where is all that debris going to go? I don't know. I mean, that's one of the questions that will need to be figured out. And what I can say, Karen, is that we haven't really begun thinking about that yet. Anything related to the day after, we really have not begun thinking that deeply in Israel. As long as there are hostages still in Gaza, our mind is not on the debris and the rubble. But obviously, that will have to be dealt with. And how do you rebuild a Gaza Strip when so much of it is literally blocks that have, in concrete and dust ruins? I did read an article about the soil being poisoned in Gaza from all the debris, and how it will make it very difficult to grow crops, or if the crops do grow, that they'll be, tainted. Again, it's not front of mind for Israelis, keeping our soldiers safe and bringing them home, getting the hostages home. That's where our minds are. But man, that's a great question. And if I have time, I'll research over this next week and try to talk to someone in in that field to find out just realistically what can be done with all the garbage, all the rubble. All right, one more comment. This is from Sam. I talked a few weeks ago about birthright, and he wrote in with a comment about birthright. He wrote, he did not himself go on birthright, but he writes about his friends. From those who went, it was basically a free trip where they could shtup each other, Yiddish there, and get drunk and high and see the sights. It was a free, fun vacation, if you will, mixed with a little bit of Hasbara, which is pro-Israel education, you might say. And he writes, while I understand the concept of Hasbara, this is not making kids more observant or connecting them with Judaism. And even if it is typically very short-lived. So I'd expressed an opinion a few weeks ago about my own cynicism about birthright. What I was saying specifically was, what would happen if we took all that money that we've been spending on birthright and instead began spending it on Jewish day school to lower the cost of Jewish education, or at the same time, summer camp? We found time and again that Jewish summer camp is the number way to keep kids Jewish and keep them interested in being Jewish in North America. Why keep funding 10-day free trips to Israel for college students when we could go younger and get them when they're still able to be impacted? It's really a matter of, do you want a last ditch effort or a first foot forward effort? And we've been putting all this emphasis and money on the last ditch effort at birthright. And, I don't know what the stats on birthright are. I've heard a lot of mixed statistics. There are certainly those who say that kids who go on birthright are more Jewishly engaged. Anecdotally, it's not what I've encountered, but you're talking about one guy just having run-ins with people who've been on birthright randomly over the years. I don't have the stats to back it up, but I personally would much rather see that money go into Jewish education and getting kids when they're 5, 6, and 7 years old going to Jewish day school or summer camps in their middle school and teen years. That is where the real impact will be made, and if we do that, we won't have to quote unquote save them um, later on. But I always love your questions and comments, so please continue to write in. You can do that at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That's also where you can get the links to these YouTube lives, which I will be doing, which I do every week. Next week's episode, it's going to be on Sunday, the 9th of February. And as those of you in America know, that is Super Bowl Sunday. Now, I know you all love Inside Israel, but far be it from me to think that I can compete with the Eagles Chiefs Super Bowl game next week. So we're going to move the pod earlier to a time of 5 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday, February 9th. Kickoff is at 6:30, and I guarantee you we will wrap up the pod by 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, probably by 6, so you can see the pregame. But next week's episode, again, 5 p.m. Eastern time on February 9th. And I'll send out the link and a reminder in the newsletter this week on Thursday. Again, if you're not on that newsletter list, sign up at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That's also where you can see the video recording of this episode. It'll be up within 24 hours. Next week, I'm going to be talking about why I'm making this career pivot to performing stand-up comedy in Israel. And I'll give you a little teaser. It's not just about Israel. It relates to the state of Judaism in North America today and what I see happening in the years to come. So make sure you tune in next week to Inside Israel. It'll be live at 5 p.m. Eastern next Sunday. You can watch the recording on my website. And of course, on Wednesdays, the episode will drop at Apple and Spotify. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone, for Comedy School Part 1. I look forward to reading your questions about comedy as you send them in. For now, I'm Joel Chasnoff, signing off. Lehitraot, and see you next time.